exactly.
Sure.
Okay. So then I will just mention a bit on this DLOC methods or normalization group methods, and a bit on how barrier interaction can be obtained from the lattice QCD calculations. Then, after that, I will move to the media, to the nuclear media. So, and I will just present some approaches that people have used to build the nuclear matter equation of state, in particular, equation of state that is needed for neutron star descriptions. And here, basically, we present a bunch of models, which in general can be classified either into ab initio approaches or phenomenological approaches. And finally, if I have time, otherwise I will do it tomorrow, I will very briefly, because Pepe is going to give a lecture on the constraints, either from nuclear physics experiments or astrophysical. But this will be simply a list of constraints. I will not really enter into too much detail. So let me start with some generalities. And I always like to start when talking about neutron stars by telling people that neutron stars are different things for different people. If you ask an astronomer what is a little neutron star, they will basically reply, well, these are very little stars visible in quotation marks, mostly as radio pulsars or sources of X-ray and gamma ray pulsars. If you ask the same question to a particle physicist, they will probably answer you that they are neutrino sources, essentially at the beginning when the neutron stars are born, the supernova. And they are probably also the only places in the universe where really the confined quark matter can really be abundant. Because there is a particular type of object that could be made only of the confined quark matter, and they are normally called strange stars. It's an hypothesis, and the debate. The same question, when this is asked to cosmologists, they say, no, these are almost black holes. And I will later tell you why it's almost, because they are very compact objects, but not so compact as a black hole. And if you ask a nuclear physicist like me, my answer will be, well, they are the biggest neutron-rich nuclei in the universe, with mass number of the order of 10 to the 56, 10 to 57 nucleons, with radius of about 10 kilometers and masses on the order of 1 or 2 solar masses. But in any way, if you ask all of them, so all these people will agree on something, and they agree on the fact that these are just one possible type of a stellar compact remnant that result from the gravitational collapse of a massive star. And massive here is a progenitor between something like 8 to 25 solar masses. And this is what remains after a supernova event of type 2, 1b, or 1c. So that is basically, well, this is probably another picture that we already, this is the third time that you see this plot probably. So now it's almost a bit more than 54 years from the discovery of the first radio pulsar by Jocelyn Bell. I don't know if they tell you that, I mean, the discovery was done by Jocelyn, but the Nobel Prize was awarded to his boss, Anthony Hevish, and another guy. And if you go to YouTube, there is a funny interview. You can find something, and you still see that Jocelyn is still does not really completely digest this fact. So anyway, since then, we know more than one, and in fact, we know more than 2,000 pulsars. So in the last 60, almost 65 years, more than 2,000 have been observed. And essentially, maybe these numbers are not completely updated, but almost. So the majority of them, so about 1,900 are radio pulsars, of which about 141 are in binary systems. So they are objects which are orbiting with another companion. And there are a small number of them which are pulsating in X-rays or in gamma rays. And from them, you can, in principle, measure many things. You can measure the period or the variation of the period with time, this P dot that was mentioned this morning. You can, in principle, also measure masses, but be careful because masses have been only measured for binary systems, not for isolated objects, because it's basically very complicated. For a binary system, I will show you hopefully at the end of the second part of the lecture, how can be measured, how masses are measured. But it's not simple, and for isolated objects, it's basically very complicated, and there is no measurement at all at this moment. Also, luminosity, so if you prefer surface temperature, because both things are related, can also measure magnetic fields, not in a direct way, but by means of some measurements of the period and the derivative, and the assumption of some particular values. And also, and we know that they also emit gravitational waves, and some of them have been already detected, either from the merger of two neutron stars, from the merger of a neutron star and a black hole, but this has not been measured. But in principle, if this event happens, also they will emit gravitational waves, and potentially they can be observed. And then there are also gravitational waves which can be detected not from the merger of two objects, but from the so-called oscillation modes of the star, which are more. In fact, I mean, the intensity of these waves are much more smaller, because some of these modes has to be with little imperfections on the star surface. So basically mountains of the size of very nothing. But of course, this is a very compact object, they rotate, and this produces a modification of the space-time that in principle can be detected. So, okay, this is again a plot that probably you've seen. This is just a distribution of the pulsars in the galactic plane. And this is basically most of them observed by the Fermi satellite in the last years. So, I mean, most of the neutron stars are observed as pulsars, but not all of them. In fact, there are many astrophysical objects which are neutron stars, but they are not observed as pulsars. So in general, you can observe neutron stars either as isolated objects or forming part of a binary system, in which the companion is either a normal ordinary star, another neutron star, or even a black hole. So in the case of isolated neutron stars, as I already mentioned, the majority of them are detected as pulsars, radio pulsars, X-ray pulsars, or gamma ray, but as I said before, not all of them pulsate. And there are some particular objects which are called in general radio quiet isolated neutron stars, which they don't pulsate. And in this case, there is two of them. This CCO, which are called the compact central object. So this is an object which is associated with a supernova remnant. It's basically a point-like object, and basically, I mean, it simply does not pulsate. And then there are the DINs, so the DIN isolated neutron star, which are objects which are characterized by a kind of black body thermal spectra. And these are not associated with any supernova remnant. So they are there, but there is no direct association with the supernova remnant. And then there are other objects, which are these so-called gamma repeaters, or the anomalous X-ray pulsar, which are now believed to be this kind of magnetized object that we're mentioning this morning. So this for the isolated guys, but as I said, some of them, most of them are living in a binary system. And in this case, they can be classified depending on the exchange of mass between the object and the companion. If there is no exchange of mass because the orbit is very large, so basically what happens is that maybe there's a kind of accretion on this, but since they don't simply reach this large point, there is basically no transfer of matter between the companion and the compact object. And then from an observational point of view, you will see something which is behave very similar as an isolated object. I mean, it's part of a system, but the system is so large that you will observe this guy as almost an isolated neutron star. If there is a change of matter between the companion and the neutron star, then what you will observe basically is an X-ray source most of the time, because it's a matter that is accreted. At the end of the day, will fall on the surface of the star, and this will produce some reactions, and then the emission of X-rays. And then in this case, there are different types of pulses. So pulsating ones, so you have X-ray pulsars, or kind of busters, so guys that from time to time they emit some kind of bursts, or some oscillations that are called quasi-periodic. And in this case, there's a kind of subclassification depending on the mass of the companion. This is completely arbitrary, but if the mass of the companion is typically 1 solar mass, this is the frontier. So if it is larger than that, then people go about high mass X-ray binaries, simply because the companion is massive. And if the mass of the companion is not so large, or the order of 1 solar mass or below, then you have these low multi-trade binaries. And then in addition, there is another classification depending on the activity. If you have a kind of persistent activity or transient, then these objects are classified as either persistent or transient curves. So this is a kind of classification, similar to what in the 19th century people classify plants and animals and whatever. So it's a kind of from the phenomenology of observation. Then, to observe these guys, well, we know that they emit mostly in all the bands of the electromagnetic spectra, and then to observe the different bands, you need different telescopes. So, of course, since most of them have radio pulsars, you will need an antenna, and these are just 3 examples of the most famous. The most famous one is the Arecibo radio telescope, and then you have the green band, which is also relatively big antenna, and then that's to give you an idea that you don't need to have a round plate. You can have another geometry for the antenna. This is the antenna in France, in Nancy, which basically consists of there is a part which is fixed, and then there's another part which is you can move. So basically to stand part of the sky, and it's equivalent. So this is not a plate, but it is equivalent to a plate antenna with a radius of that diameter of 94 meters, more or less. But then, of course, they also emit in the infrared, optical, and ultraviolet. And then you need very large, for instance, these are the very large telescopes in the Atacama Desert. Or for the ultraviolet, you need something on top of the atmosphere, and then in that case, what has been used is the Hubble. And if you want to detect the very energetic radiation, what you need you need telescopes covering the X-ray and the gamma rays, basically in the form of satellites. So this is for the electromagnetic signal, but as I mentioned at the beginning, they also emit neutrinos. So another source of information comes from neutrinos, especially when they are formed. And then to detect neutrinos, you need some neutrino detectors. And this is just some few examples of neutrinos detectors that are already operating or will operate in the future. Executing. So these are, okay, this is the Amanda telescope, just to give you an idea of how it is. This is under the ice. And okay, this is the Eiffel Tower, just to give you an idea that this is the size of this detector. And then there is this ice cube detector, this project, where basically you have also a kind of cube, very low, something of a few kilometers under the ice. Or you put the detectors under the water. And in this case, this is a project where Catania is working, this TN3 net. So basically, this is a kind of cube of kilometer to 3. So the volume is 1 kilometer times 1 kilometer. And this is under the sea and is basically being installed at the south of Sicily. And then Antares. I think Antares is placed or going to be placed close to Marseille, somewhere in the sea. And then, of course, you have the most probably known one, which are the underground telescopes. In this case, you have the Kamioka or Super Kamioka detector in Japan, or this SNO, which is in a mine in Canada. So these are neutrino detectors, but then now we know that we can also use gravitational waves to study neutron stars, and this is a new way of observing them. And this is just, I will just give you more details a bit later, but this is just to give you an idea of at the present, the different antennas which are operating now. So you have the Vigo, LIGO, and also some other ones. And so this is the new way, new astronomy in neutron star physics. So I think probably today or yesterday, somebody mentioned okay, that these guys are fastly rotating objects, but if you measure you make a kind of distribution of the different pulsars, what you immediately notice is that there are kind of two families of pulsars. So there is a big family of objects which have a rotational period of the order of 1 second, and these are the so-called normal pulsars. The name is completely arbitrary. We decided to call it normal. And then there is the second family, much less abundant, of the so-called millisecond pulsars. So these are objects which are rotating with periods of the order of milliseconds. And until 1982, there was none of these objects observed. The first one was observed in 82 in Arecibo, and now we know that at least there are more than about 200 of these millisecond guys, of these milliseconds. And the fastest one at this moment is this object here, which was discovered in this globular cluster, and already almost 15 years ago, or 16. And this guy is rotating at with a period of 1.4 milliseconds. So it's very, very fast. And at this moment, it's still the fastest one. So it's a record. Now the question that you can ask yourself, I think was also mentioned at some point this morning. So why they spin so fast? And the answer, or at least the simple answer, is simply because the angular momenta is conserved. And then when it's conserved during the gravitational collapse of the iron core. And in fact, if you just make some simple calculations, and then you assume that the object that you form is a sphere, or a homogeneous sphere with a mass m, and the radius is basically changing from thousands of kilometers to 10 kilometers, in the end of the day, and then you put standard numbers for the initial period of the progenitor, in the end, you get that. In fact, you get the periods of the order of seconds or milliseconds, depending on this ratio. Okay, maybe there is other reasons, but you don't need really to invoke very exotic physics. So just with the conservation of angular momenta, you get at least the order of magnitude. It seems to be this. And then, this was also shown this morning. This is the PP dot diagram, and the PP dot diagram is a kind of equivalent to the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram for ordinary stars, in the sense that this is a kind of evolutionary plot. So you have, and this was also mentioned this morning, you have observations of the period and the variation of the period, and then you plot it here. And then immediately, this was also mentioned, you notice that there is a big number of objects which sits more or less in this region. And then there are two other families, these two extreme cases. One, and then of course you need some models. So in the most simple model, which I don't know if was mentioned, is the dipole model. So you assume that the neutron star is a dipole. You can deduce basically these two simple equations which relate, okay, in this case, the log of the P dot and the P. And then this allows you to draw some lines of constant time, or h. So here h is increasing in this direction. So there's the youngest objects are sitting somewhere here, and then the oldest ones are sitting here. And then this is from here, from this equation. The other one is basically allows you to draw lines at constant magnetic field. So it means that the lowest magnetic fields are here, and then when you move in that direction, you get objects with larger magnetic field. And it's an evolutionary plane in the sense that, okay, you say, okay, let's assume that we have an object that is formed somewhere here, and it will evolve in time. So basically, it will decrease its period, no? Because it's radiating, so it's basically slow, spinning down. So it will move. Let's assume it's not really true, because the magnetic field is not constant. It will, but let's assume just for simplicity that is constant. So it will basically move along a line of constant magnetic field, the same, more or less, and it's increasing his edge. It's becoming older and older. So it's basically moving in this direction. And that sense is basically similar to the Hertzsprung-Russell, because you move from the main sequence to the red, gen red, and so on and so forth. That is exactly the same. And then, okay, there is a region here, which is called the gray jar of the pulsar, because there is no object here. There is no observation here. So basically, there is a kind of line here, where at some point, the objects are recycled or somewhere. And in fact, this was also mentioned this morning. So all these guys here are very old guys with low magnetic fields. And they are speeding very fast, because basically they are in an orbit with a companion, and basically they are increasing his angular momentum, his speed. So basically, so you can more or less read a kind of the evolutionary history of pulsars from this kind of diagram. And at the same time, this is the type of diagram that is used in order to infer more or less get an estimation of the value of the magnetic field. So at some point this morning was pulsars glitches were mentioned. So glitches are basically this kind of this is a real plot of the glitches that have been observed in the Vela pulsar. This is basically increases on the spin frequency, or if you prefer, decreasing of the period. So from time to time, and it's not periodic, but it's quite regular, you have some increase, suddenly increases of the frequency, which are not very large. So typically, they are in this range. So the ratio between this increase with respect to the spin frequency is something between 10 to the minus 9, 10 to the minus 5. It's not very big, but it's remarkable. The first one were observed in the CRAF and the Vela pulsar, but now we know that at least 800 pulsars showed glitches, and about more than 500 have been observed in all this. The origin of the glitches is not clear. There are different models, and one of the most really reliable ones is the so-called vortex line model. In this case, the idea is that you have, I will describe, a bit of the structure of the star. So you have basically a crust in the most external part, which is a kind of solid. And then in the interior, below this crust, you have a nuclear matter, homogeneous matter. Or in particular, nucleons are superfluid. So what happens is that most of this, since you have a quantum fluid and it's rotating, you form vortices, essentially, at some point. And the idea behind is that at some point, for some reason, there is a last migration of vortices from the interior, from the homogeneous matter to the crust. And they deposit a macroscopic amount of angular momentum to the crust. And this happens from time to time. So you have vortices, and then from some reason, at some point, all these vortices migrate, move to the crust. They deposit, for one vortex is just angular momentum is quantized, but you have a large number of them that migrate. And it's when all this quantity of angular momentum that is deposited or is transferred to the crust, when essentially you produce an increase of the spin frequency. This is okay. This is a model. It's not. Well, maybe it's not like that, but this is one of the models which is more reliable. There are other models that assume that what is really happening is a kind of earthquake, star quakes in the crust, because the crust in fact is solid, and then you have some kind of mechanism that produces this kind of thing. But that again is a model. Or some other people, other possibilities is that you have some kind of instabilities. There are magnetic fields, and then maybe there are some kind of magnetospheric instabilities, or some instabilities in the motion of the nucleon or the neutron superfluid. But anyway, the idea is that you have from time to time this sudden increase of the frequency, and then then there was also this, depending on how fast you go back to the original, this gives this classification that was also mentioned this morning. So the magnetic field, so as I said before, so you can use these measurements on the period and the variation of the period together with the model to deduce or to extract some values for the magnetic field. And basically, according to the magnetic field, you can classify the pulsars into 3 types. Okay, I have to mention that this is surface magnetic field. So these values are the magnetic fields at the surface of the stars, and in the interior they can be much larger. So if the field is something between 10 to 8 or 10 to 9 Gauss, this is this region here in this corner, and these are the millisecond pulsars. So these guys that rotate very fast, because they basically are living in this corner, which correspond to all objects, but with relatively low magnetic fields compared to the rest. Then the big family of the normal pulsars, so these guys here, they basically correspond to a region in which the magnetic field, on average, is of the order of 10 to 12. This is a typical value that you normally listen. 10 to 12 is for the normal pulsar, for the majority of them. And then they have these guys here, so the magnetars, which are extremely magnetized objects. And they are living here in regions where the magnetic fields at the surface can reach values of the order of 10 to the 14 or 10 to the 15. And I insist, these are the values at the surface. So in the interior, they can be much larger. Anyway, even the smallest one are magnetic fields which are extremely high compared to more usual fields. The magnetic field in the Earth which is about 0.3, 0.5 Gauss, which is basically nothing, or even the sunspots, which are still 4 orders of magnitude smaller. And then, of course, much smaller than the typical, or than the largest magnetic fields that you can create on the Earth. So now the question, okay, why with these objects have so large magnetic field in the surface? And the point is that there is still not a clear answer. There are many possibilities. And again, the most simple one already gives you the order of magnitude, which is simply that, well, simply you conserve the magnetic flux during the gravitational collapse, exactly as in the case of the angular momentum. And in fact, so if you assume the conservation of the magnetic flux, and then you put typical values for the magnetic field of the progenitor and the radius of the progenitor, you can get, in fact, the proper order of magnitude. So you don't need to invoke very strange mechanisms, very exotic ones, to get at least the order of magnitude. But of course, this is not just the only thing. Probably there are kind of dynamo mechanisms on electric currents in the interior of the star that probably they induce a kind of the microscopic magnetic moment, and this is at the origin of the field. From a point of view of a nuclear physicist, a possibility that has been explored is that maybe the nuclear interaction at some point prefers to put all the spins of the nucleons or the baryons in general oriented on the same direction, and then this creates a macroscopic magnetic moment. Unfortunately, this situation is not clear because it's extremely model dependent. In fact, people has analyzed these problems in many years on a very simplified model. So basically, what they are studying is they're taking a piece of nuclear matter, of asymmetric nuclear matter, so matter with different number of neutrons and protons, and in addition, they just assume that also the spins are not saturated. So you assume different number of neutrons with the spin up and down, and the same for protons. And then what the people have done, okay, you have your system, which is basically described either in terms of the fold partial densities, or you can introduce some kind of asymmetry numbers. So this is isospin asymmetry, which tells you basically the imbalance between neutrons and protons, and then you can introduce something similar for the spin. So this is telling you how many neutrons or protons you have with the spin up or down. And then with this, and with a particular model, what people have calculated is the so-called magnetic susceptibility. So the curvature of the energy per particle with respect to the spin polarization. And then, as you know, you have a function with a positive or negative curvature. This is a signal of instability or not. This is exactly the same. So if you see that this quantity is positive at a given density, that means that the system is stable against any fluctuation of the spin. So this, you have the system, you make some perturbation, and he wants to be unpolarized. If the spin susceptibility is positive. If it is negative, it is not the case. The system wants to be polarized. So you find something like that. So this is a schematic plot. Depending on the model, you have, okay, this is in fact the inverse. Okay, what is as the spin susceptibility for the free case divided by the one of the particular model. And then, okay, if it is positive, like here or here, then this new system is stable. So this is not going to produce any instability, ferromagnetic instability. But if you see a crossing, and then I'm changing the sign for the susceptibility, this is a signal that from this density on, the system wants to be polarized, which means that the nuclear interaction wants to put all the spins on the same direction. And this could be a possible explanation for the magnetic field of the star. But as I say, this has been considered by many people, but the results are contradictory. So depending on the producer, it's a very old problem. You go back to the 60s to start to see the first studies on this thing. And then depending on the model, so in general, what you see is that all the calculations that were used, and I will describe with detail all these kind of models. Some phenomenological interactions like the Scherm or Boigny, most of them, especially the oldest, there are new Scherms which correct this problem. They all of them predict a transition to a ferromagnetic state, depending on the model, from saturation density up to 4 times saturation density, more or less. Whereas on the other side, all the calculations which are based on, I call realistic nuclear-nuclear or nuclear-nuclear interaction realistic in the sense that there are interactions which are built in order to reproduce the scattering data, so phase shifts and also the properties of the neutrons. And then on top of that, and I will enter in these details, you build the equation of state. So none of them, so all of, let's say, the up initial calculation, none of them predicts this behavior. And nowadays, even if the problem is still not open, the majority of the people think that this transition simply does, so that the nuclear interaction does not predict this transition. And in fact, if you have a model for the nuclear interaction that predicts this transition, probably is a signal that is some pathology in the interaction. And in fact, for the scale interaction, there is a new generation of the scale forces which have corrected this problem. So none of them from the last 5 to 8 to 10 years, none of them present this instability. So this seems to be at least the present situation, that nobody believes that the nuclear interaction, well, nobody believes. It seems that the nuclear interaction does not want to polarize the systems. So probably this just probably don't. An estimation, a very simple estimation of the mass and the radius of a neutron star. And this is related with the fact that I will show you that in fact a neutron star is really an atomic nuclei. You have seen that probably. Okay, so I go fast. Okay, so a very simple way is okay. You have a neutron star, and then you assume that is simply made of is a sphere, a uniform sphere, and it's only made of neutrons. And you see that you add that in addition to the nuclear force, you have the gravity, so neutron field gravity. And then the idea here is to use the semi-empirical mass formula to deduce the mass and the radius of the object. So you start from the Bethe-Weizsäcker semi-empirical mass formula, and then you assume that okay, we don't have protons, so that is equal to 0, and then you add the potential gravitational energy for a sphere with a mass which is just the number of neutrons times the mass of the nucleon on a given radius. So you have this thing. And now here you simply can assume that like n, so the number of nucleons is much larger than these two numbers, so simply you can neglect them, and then you have only these two quantities. Or you assume that the radius of the star is just like a nucleus. It's R0 times the number, in this case, there are only neutrons, the number of neutrons to 1/3. And then you say that okay, this guy is bound. So you impose that this binding energy is positive, because you know, I mean, you have an object which is bound. Then you impose this, and from here you get a condition for the minimum number of the neutrons that your object will have. And this depends only on two quantities, which is the symmetry energy coefficient of the semi-empirical mass formula, the volume term, R0, and the gravitational constant, and the mass of the neutrons. So you can put numbers on this. And when you put the numbers, you get something of the order of 10 to the 56, 10 to the 57, which is exactly more or less what people think. So you have a very large number of nucleons of this order. And then you, with this number, you multiply by the mass of the neutrons, and then you see that the mass is of the order of 1 solar mass. And again, since you have everything, you can also calculate the radius, because it's R0 times n to that 1/3. And you get something of the order of 10 kilometers. So this is telling you, okay, and then if you compute the average density, you get the typical value, 10 to the 14, 10 to the 15 grams per cubic centimeter. So this is simply telling you that the neutron star is simply a gigantic atomic nucleus. Simply, and where the particle is simply bound by gravity. So if you switch off gravity, the nuclear force is not enough to bound the object, and it will simply. So it's an atomic nucleus bound by gravity. And okay, it's something quite incredible, because if you compare with the sun, so it's a guy which has the mass of the sun, but it's about 70,000 times smaller. So this is what the object we are talking about. So I will give more details tomorrow, but just to give you an idea of what we think was the interior weight of a neutron star. So if you want to determine the composition of a neutron star, you need a model and blah, blah, blah. But in the end of the day, given a model, what you have to impose is charge neutrality, so two conditions. charge neutrality, and equilibrium of with respect to the weak interaction processes. That's all. This gives you a system of equations together with the baryon number conservation that when you solve that will give you exactly the fraction of each component. Okay, you have to decide which type of component. You want just neutrons and protons and leptons or whatever, but can you decide which type of constituent you want, which interaction, because that you will need to compute the chemical potentials. And then when you have all this, solving this set of equations, the equilibrium equation, give you an idea of the composition. But in general, what you have is an object, okay, this is not in scale, which is typically 10 kilometers of radius, with about okay, there is the most external part, which is not lost here, is the atmosphere and the surface. So in fact, the object has a very small atmosphere, which is, depending on the models, it can be made of just hydrogen or helium or some more heavy elements, but it's just the last part of the first one. But if you go to the interior, then you have this 1 kilometer region, which is the crust, and I will give you details tomorrow on the crust, which basically, just to give you an idea, can be divided into two regions. There is the first region of the crust, which is called the outer crust region, and in this region, okay, tomorrow we'll tell you better. It's basically a region which is a solid region where you have nuclei of the family of iron forming a lattice, and then in addition you have some electron gas surrounding. Then at some point you reach the density of the neutron drift, and then you enter the so-called inner crust region. But in addition to the nuclei, which are very neutron rich, you have the electron gas, and then you have a gas of neutrons, because at some point you have electron catchers, the neutrons that are produced cannot be bound in the nuclei, and then they start to form a gas that is moving around the nucleus. And then at some point, okay, and in addition, you have these pasta phases that I will describe tomorrow, so inhomogeneities basically. And then at some point, when you reach a region, a density of typically 2/3 of saturation density, everything melts, and then you have an enormous piece of homogeneous nuclear matter in equilibrium with respect to the weak interaction. So basically, you have a soup of nucleons and leptons at the beginning, up to some given density, 2 or 3 times zero, where something else can be in the interior, and this here is not clear. So in the real inner core, so this part.
Don't touch the screen.
Yeah. So in the most inner part of the core, it's not really clear what is inside. And you can have, tomorrow I will essentially concentrate on the possibility of having hyperons, but people have considered the possibility of having meson condensates, or even the confined quark matter, or even something more strange. But okay, tomorrow I will just move to this. This is just to present. Now this is for remember that at some point I told you that our cosmologists will tell you that the neutron star is almost a black hole. And this is simply because if you compute this compactness parameter, which is just basically the Schwarzschild radius times the number, these numbers tell you how compact is an object, or how strong is the gravitational field at the surface of the star. And then when you do this, for the case of the Earth, this number is very small. It's 10 to the minus 10. So you can. This is telling you that the Earth is not very compact, and then you can forget about relativistic effects. And the same happens with the Sun. The Sun is very big, but still this number is small. And even for a white dwarf, so this is Sirius B, and in this case, this is still a relatively small number. But when you look, okay, of course, for the case of a black hole, this is 1. But for a neutron star, this is not so small. It's about 0.2, 0.4. So it's a number which is relatively large. And this is telling you that if you want to compute the structure of a neutron star, you have to take into account general relativity. So you cannot use Newtonian gravity. And this is why to study the structure of a neutron star, you have to solve this famous, okay, for the case of a static, non-rotating and spherical object, is the Thomann-Oppenheimer-Volkow. Just for curiosity, the paper is for 1939, but there is a Chandrasekhar and von Neumann. They did something similar, So they deduce exactly the same set of equations, but they never publish the work. So, so that's simply that. Okay, maybe this equation would have been told Chandrasekhar von Neumann, but they don't publish anything. So, but,
How did you know?
Eh?
How did you know that if they don't publish?
Because that because they I read this somewhere, I don't remember where, but there was some people from St. Petersburg. There's a guy called anyway, he was making some kind of a study, I mean, some historical, and he found some notes or books or letters or whatever, where it seems that they did use this equation. They exchanged some correspondence between Chandrasekhar and von Neumann. Anyway, these are the top equations, which essentially what they describe is just the hydrostatic equilibrium of a relativistic gas. So you have basically gradient of pressure, so it tries to expand the object, and then on the other side you have the gravity. And if you forget about all these terms, this is just Newton. So there are corrections for general relativity in it actually, but this is smaller than it. So, okay, one thing that I don't know if it was mentioned that on this paper, these three guys assumed that the matter was made only of neutrons and free, completely free, and they found that the maximum was only of 0.7, which was a bit, I mean, much below the Chandrasekhar limit. And this is simply telling you that this is because of the interaction. So the interactions are very important. So if you simply, and this was done some years later by, I think, Cameron, I don't know. I think it was Cameron. So okay, there was a second paper some years later in the 40s or in the 50s, where they include for the first time some interactions, and they were able to reach the 1 point something, which is telling you that okay, you really need. So it's true that the nuclear interaction is not binding the object, but it's needed if you want to have a good description of the star. So. Why it's not changing? Okay. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I don't know. How I go back. Okay. So when you solve the top equation, basically the solution that you get, they are static equilibrium configurations, and this means that can be unstable and stable and unstable solutions. So you get the two solutions, in fact. And then, of course, on the top of the solutions, if you want the stable ones, this means that they have to impose these two conditions. So the variation of the mass with respect to the density should be positive or negative, the variation with respect to the density. Just to, but okay, without entering into too much details, you can simply understand this in a very simple way. We're looking into this plot. So this is the typical mass, okay, mass versus radius, a kind of graph. But and here you have mass versus density. Now imagine that you have a solution on this branch, and then you imagine that you make some perturbation. So you compress the object. Then you move. Imagine this is your solution, and then you compress. So you move a bit on the right. So at this density, you have less mass than the solution. In this case, at this density, the solution for the top equation is telling you that the mass is this. So you have less mass than the one that corresponds to this density. So you have less mass. You have a balance between gravity and pressure. It means that pressure will win. So the object will expand. If it expands, it means that density will decrease. So it means that even if you make a perturbation, put in your system here, the pressure will bring you back to this point. And the same here. So if you compress, if you expand your object, then you will perturbate, you will put it somewhere here. Here you have mass, your mass is larger than the one that corresponds to this density. And then since mass is larger, the gravity will compress the object, and then you will go back here. So in all this range, your solutions are stable, always, whatever you do, or whatever perturbation you do. The opposite happens when you cross the maximum. If you have a solution here and you do the same, if you compress your object, increasing the density, then you have much larger mass than the mass that corresponds at this density. So the object will continue compressing and then it will collapse. Or the opposite, if you expand your object, then you will be in some region here with less mass than the one that corresponds, and then the object will be basically expand and then you go back. So all these branches are unstable. So basically, this is what is telling you. And since you have a branch which is stable and a branch which is unstable, you have a maximum. And then these equations predict the existence of a maximum mass. So, and now we are entering in the game. So the only ingredient that you need to solve the TOF equation, or if you include rotation, the additional equation that you need when you have rotation, is the equation of the state. So it's a thermodynamical relation between the pressure and the energy density of matter. So what you have to do is, okay, you have to choose your matter constituents. You say, okay, I want to describe a neutron star which is made only of neutrons and leptons, or I want to put also some exotic particles or whatever. I need some model for the interactions. And then I cook everything with a many-body theory in order to obtain my equation of state. Once I have my equation of state, I plug this on the computer, and then I solve the TOF equation, and then I get the final mass versus radius or mass versus whatever property. So this is what we are going to focus now. Finally, so that was the end of the generalities. Now let's go to the more serious. I don't know much. Okay, I will start and I will stop. So this is a kind of quite evident thing. So the nuclear equation of state is the fundamental ingredient to studying not only the properties, statistical, static and dynamical properties of neutron star, but also for the core collapse supernova and also for the neutron star merger with some other object. The problem is that it's very difficult to determine, and it's very difficult because what you need is the equation of state. Okay, if you are interested only in neutron stars at the so-called catalyzed neutron star, which objects which are basically at zero temperature, you don't need to care about temperature, the temperature dependence of the equation of state. But if you want also to describe core collapse supernova or the merger, you also need to know what is the temperature dependence of the equation of state. But not only that, of course, you need to know this in a very large range of densities and isospin asymmetries. And just to give you an idea, so this is just a plot of the different conditions of temperature, isospin asymmetry, and density that have to be covered in the description, in this particular case, of the. So basically, this is what you need to describe the collapse of a massive star, in this case of 15 solar masses, from the beginning of the collapse up to about 25 milliseconds after the bound. So this is what people that do supernova simulation, whatever, need. They need the equation of state in all these range of values. So density is ranging from 10 to 5 to 10 to the 15 grams per cubic centimeter. The temperature going from almost 0 up to 100 MeV. And also the isospin asymmetry was basically from pure neutron matter up to about half up to symmetric nuclear matter. So you have to really cover a very huge range of values of these variables. And the problem is that first, the baryon-baryon interaction, the free one, is very complex. So we will not know completely in the free space. So imagine that on top of this, we should know the very interaction in the medium. So this is the main complexity. The second complexity is that this is a media with it's a many-body system. So you have to solve the many-body problem, the nuclear many-body problem, and this is very complicated by itself. But it's more complicated because the interaction is complicated. So we have these two problems. We have to know to build some model for the interaction, and later we have to solve the many-body problem. So that is the two problems. Anyway, whatever you do, you build some kind of, or you want to build a realistic or at least reliable equation of state that is able to describe neutron star matter, you should at least satisfy few things. The first thing that you satisfy that when you apply this to the most simple case, which is symmetric nuclear matter, you should reproduce properly the saturation point. Otherwise, forget about it, because if you are not able to reproduce saturation properties, which is more or less under control, then you cannot pretend to describe matter at much higher densities. For instance, you also have to give, or your model should predict reliable values of the symmetry, for instance, something on the range 28, 32 MeV, and also the incompressibility. And you should guarantee also that the behavior of the symmetry energy, I will come later, or that the symmetry should behave well at high densities. And by well, I mean basically you don't want a model that at some point probably have a kind of isospin instability, in the sense that you don't want that at some point neutron matter is more bound than symmetric matter, typically. And then the nuclear incompressibility, because you have data from the spectrum in the lab, and you should model, you should be compatible with the data. And this is important, you will respect causality. So you don't want a model that is not causal. So these are the minima that any model that you want to build have to fulfill. So let's move to the bone of the lesson, to the baryon interaction. Maybe I stop
here.
Yeah, well, maybe you can stop and then.
Yeah. Okay, so we stop for, I don't know, maybe we can just take a few questions if there are any questions, you know, online.
Yes, I think I have a curiosity.
Yes, okay. You are?
I'm Mantia. Okay, it comes from when you were speaking about the pulsar glitches. If I remember properly, you said that in the vortex line model, the superfluid, which is rotating inside, suddenly migrates from the interior to the crust. Then it's a transfer of angular momenta to the crust, and then it increases the spin frequency. That makes me wonder if when you are observing the information you have of the period just comes from the crust. I mean, you just know the period of the crust, but inside you don't know how it is rotating.
Well, in fact, that is an interesting question, because in fact, I mean, at the end of the day, you don't really know, because in fact, these objects, I mean, in most of the models, people assume that you have a kind of solid body and it's rotating from the center to the exterior at the same frequency, but this is probably not the case. So probably the real situation in the study is that it has a kind of differential rotation. So you have a kind of profile. And then in fact, it's not what you measure, in fact, is probably, so you're measuring the rotation of the last layer. But this is not guaranteed that all the stars rotating probably at this frequency.
Okay, so they can be like two velocities or more than
probably,
two, I mean.
It's not clear. So I mean, in fact, I mean, probably it's the case. So in the real star, probably you have this kind of a kind of profile of rotation. So each layer probably rotating at a given frequency.
Okay, and you only know the most external one.
And probably you know it's like the magnetic field. So what you measure, so at the end of the day, you measure what you see from the. In fact, that is why also the crust is very important, because any information that comes from the interior has to pass through the crust. So the crust is a kind of a filter. So everything has to be filtered from the crust. And so in the end of the day,
Okay.
Well,
okay, thanks.
In the stability, the plots of the stability of the star, because I see that one condition is the derivative of the mass of the total star, the derivative with respect to the central density. I see the left one, but I don't see why is the other condition.
Well, it's the same. I mean, the condition is, I mean, you can write either in terms of the derivatives with respect to density, or it's just the same.
Because that R is not the radial coordinate.
But is the radial coordinate, not this one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is the radial coordinate of the
is the radius, okay.
Is the radius of
the radius of the star, okay.
Okay.
Maybe you should have written in.
But I don't see why is that a stability condition, because you could have an equation of state that gives to a mass radius diagram which goes, in fact, the derivative of the mass with respect to the radius increases. Well, it could there are some.
Yes, and this, you are thinking on something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is important because this is a mass radius relation for typically for a quark star. Yes, and in fact, this is one of the observables, let me call it like that, that will be really used to distinguish. So you have something that is something like that is telling you that. But you have to be careful because sometimes.
I mean, I know that your neutron star, realistic neutron star won't have that shape. I mean, you should have a, maybe I am a little bit biased, but you should have a crust. So
the crust sometimes do like that. So you have some region where it goes.
You're right.
But this sometimes is also it's model dependent because and it depends quite a lot on the way how you match your equation of. I mean, when you solve the top equations, you have an equation of stress for the interior, and then sometimes you have also for the crust, and then you have to match at some point. And this matching, this numerically is tricky. So sometimes these shapes that you are thinking about are kind of artificial because in some calculation because it's simply the way these two equations of states are matched. Because with the same equation of state, you use a different because you have to impose continuity, the derivative, blah blah blah. And if you don't do it properly, you can have some behaviors that in fact are simply artificial of the way how you have constructed this. Now this is interesting because it's not so. I mean, there have been some debates in the last year on how to really produce a unified equation of the state that describes properly from the center to the crust, and with the crust properly matched to the interior.
Okay.
You have a question? If not, well, please stop a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, and then ¿te cansas?
No, estoy bien. Sí. Bueno, me estoy sorprendiendo de mí mismo, que no me está fastidiando. No me voy a poner a bailar tampoco, pero no está mal. No me la traje por eso, porque no sabía dónde está de pie. También sirve de puntero. Sí, también sirve de puntero, aunque no creo que.
Es que se ha llevado más ya un.
Yo tengo una banda.
No, pero es uno que ve la gente, que se ve.
Que te ve la gente.
Y se la lleva porque estaba sin carga. Y se la ha llevado y ha intentado ponerlo en marcha. Y no. Creo que lo está cargando, pregúntale si quieres.
Yo no tengo frío ahora mismo. Ahora mismo no.
Cuando está abierto todo eso. Tú, porque estos chicos no tenían mucho frío. Sí, o la edad, que no es la misma.
Es un factor 2, una estrella de neutrones no nos importaría. Factor 2 sería muy bien. Ni siquiera un factor 2, es menos de un factor 2.
Sí.
Creo que no voy a llegar al final de lo que tenía planeado para hoy. Pero bueno.
Bueno, si no, pues.
Bueno, mañana porque. La chica esta, no sé qué preguntar. Esto es verdad.
De hecho, porque es Antía que se ha quedado en el despacho.
¿Y dónde está?
En el despacho.
Se
ha quedado en el despacho. Porque de hecho, en el modelo de dipolo, ahí sí que se asume un sólido rígido.
Sí, y la mayor parte de los modelos.
Entonces, y de alguna manera, mal no funciona porque el diagrama P' sale de ahí, como te has dicho.
Seguramente.
Entonces, pero.
O sea, es verdad que la mayor parte de los modelos asumen que es un sólido rígido y que todo rota. O sea, la gente que hace rotación. Hay gente que se dedica a
rotación diferencial. Pero si hay un superfluido en el interior, claro, no es cierto.
No, claro.
Y el interior no es pequeño, es decir, es casi todo. Claro,
De hecho,
excepto
sí,
el
de hecho,
elemento de fuera, todo lo demás, si de verdad es un superfluido, casi todos los modelos estos, ¿no? que dicen que eso es superfluido, pues eso está rotando mucho más. Okay, so maybe we can continue.
Okay, so let's then go to the description of the baryon-baryon interaction, and okay, again let me start with more generalities. So in principle, okay, if you know that QCD is really the fundamental theory of external interaction, and the problem, and in principle, the baryon-baryon interaction could be a priori be determined from the underlying extract quark gluon dynamics in QCD. The problem is that this theory, even if it's very elegant and very nice, is a non-abelian gauge theory and makes things complicated. So in particular, one of the problems is that, well, this is just a plot of the strong coupling constant as a function of the momentum. I mean, you know, is that well, when you go to the region of low or medium energies, I mean, QCD becomes highly non-perturbative, and it's because the strong coupling constant simply increases. And then this simply makes life very, very difficult. And essentially, at the end of the day, I mean, we cannot deduce, at least at this moment, the baryon-baryon interaction directly from QCD. So we have to survive with some alternative, and the alternative is okay to use some simplified models in which instead of using the quark and gluon degrees of freedom, we use hadronic degrees of freedom, so baryons, so and mesons. So in fact there are different, or people have explored different models, and well, I basically will try to describe very briefly, so I will not enter into too much details because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this would require a much more than 3 hours. But I will concentrate on let's say, so I will start some historically from the phenomenological models, so the traditional meson exchange and the potential models, and then I will mention something on the more appealing at this moment models which are based on chiral effective field theory, and then I will say something on the models in which the interaction is renormalized in some way to remove the high momentum components, which are the ones which create really problems. And then I will mention something on lattice QCD, but not so much because I'm not really an expert on lattice, so I will everything probably will. I will say few because I say many things. I will say many stupidities to stay in the model. So let me start with the meson exchange models. So as you probably know, I mean, these models are based on the Yukawa idea. In fact, the first meson exchange model goes back in time to Yukawa. And in this case, I mean, the interaction is simply mediated interaction between two baryons by the exchange of mesons. And well, what you have here is a schematic plot of the potential energy between two. I will mention, I mean, I will say baryon, but in fact, what I have in mind most of the time is nucleon. So you have, as a function of the radius, so you have a long range part, which is mediated by this change of pseudoscalar mesons. So in the original world of Yukawa, yes, pions, but then there are models which include also kaons and eta prime. The intermediate range is mediated by scalar mesons, the sigma, which is not a real meson, is a resonance, is still not clear, the kappa and the delta, and the short range part, or the part which is highly repulsive. This is basically due to the change of vector mesons, basically the rho mesons, K star, omega, and Cs. And there are different models in the that have been constructed under this philosophy, and the main difference essentially are on the different type of mesons that they consider. If they include one type or two or three, and also I have not mentioned here, there are also processes which are basically due to the exchange of two mesons, two pions, and also the treatment of these two meson exchange processes is different on the different models. So in any case, so these are the most popular ones. So the Paris bond, or the different version of the bond potential, the CD bond or bond A, bond B, or whatever you want, and then Nijmegen ones. Yeah, there is also a family, Nijmegen, whatever. And also, okay, the bond Jülich, you prefer, because have the same people. Anyway, all of them are successful in the description of also because I mean there are parameters, and the parameters have been adjusted to produce scattering data, so scattering phase shift, and of course the properties of the deuteron. So this, let's say, with respect to the nucleon, and then also in the sector of with the strangeness of the hyperon nucleon, there are models which are based on this philosophy, and essentially are some extensions of the bond and the number. In fact, there is Jülich models are basically the same type of model from the bond. The only thing is they make a kind of assume some symmetry SU3, and then they extend all the vertices to include hyperon, and the same for the Nijmegen ones. So,
may I ask a question, because I am not an expert on this model? So here the idea is that you either integrate out or do a kind of mean field approximation for the mesons, and then this gives you effective potentials between the nucleons, which are
no, let me. It's similar. So the idea is the following. So you start from some Lagrangian that describe the different vertices. So, and which type of Lagrangian? Well, these are the typical Lagrangians that you assume. So if you assume, okay, that is basically what you. So these are the more general type of Lagrangians that you can derive. And then, of course, depending on the meson, you have some couplings that describe the strength of the interaction, and then you have the coupling itself. So you have a scalar meson, you have typical scalar meson, and then there's Dirac spinors for the variance. If you have a pseudo-scalar, then in your vertex you have the typical Dirac E gamma 5 that gives you the proper parity for this. I have to say something that for the pseudo-scalar meson, there is an alternative coupling, which is called sometimes the pseudo-vector or gradient, because you have basically a derivative here, which goes with these gamma matrices. And this is has basically suggested some kind of symmetry. Okay, it's another possibility. It's not that you include both, but sometimes you have two possibilities. And then you have the vector meson Lagrangian, where you have basically this pair, which describes the structure of the vector itself, and then you have a kind of tensor coupling. So you have a coupling where you have your vector meson here, coupled with this gamma matrix, and then you have this other object here, which is basically a tensor pair. So these are, and something that I didn't mention is that this is the way these Lagranges are written if your mesons are isoscalar, so if they don't have a isospin dependence. If you have an isospin dependence and you want to describe the isovector part, then basically you have the same Lagrangian. You only have to replace each meson by the scalar product of the Pauli matrix times the guy. And then with this, you have your basic ingredients. Then you can build a potential. So how you do that? So this is the typical, most simple three diagram that you can imagine. So you have two nucleons or two variants in general with two momenta. They exchange some meson, whatever it is, and then they go to final state. And then you have these two vertices, which contains the corresponding coupling. And then this gamma here is just this Dirac structure. So it's any of these operators here. So if you exchange a scalar, it's just identity. You have a pseudo scalar, it's yeah. You have a vector, and it's just the gamma mu. You have this tensor part, this is sigma mu, which is just that commutator of the gamma matrices. And if you have a pseudo vector, then you have this structure. And then you simply apply the Feynman rules. So you have that your matrix elements in momentum space is you simply read from you have in this vector you have the Dirac spinor of this variant, and then you have here a vertex, which is just a coupling times the structure of the vertex. Then, of course, you have this guy here, which is just a propagator of your meson. And then you have, I will describe later. So all these quantities of this P divided by this is just a propagator, the meson propagator. And then on the other side, okay, and sorry. And then here before the propagator, you have the outgoing variant. And the same for the other vectors. So this is what you have. And then, of course, depending on the type of meson that you exchange, you replace by the corresponding Dirac Dirac spinor, you do all the calculation. Sometimes it's tedious because you have to do it by hand, but in the end you get the typical structure, and then I will come later. Yeah. So in general, the complete potential will be the sum over all the different types of mesons that you decide to exchange of all these matrix elements. This is a momentum space. So typically, if you want to work in momentum space, that's the end of the day. So with this, you can solve the Lyman-Springer equation if you want to obtain the T matrix, and then you can obtain phase shift or whatever you want. If you want the representation of the potential in coordinate space, then you have something else. You have to do a transformation. You have to Fourier transform this guy. So typically what the people do is, okay, before transforming this, okay, this is still completely relativistic. So there is a non-relativistic reduction. And this basically, you have to take the Dirac spinor that I fortunately didn't write them explicitly. But anyway, you simply expand on the inverse of the mass of the margin at lower order, and then you get, okay, I wrote this very generally, but if you expand this and then replace and do all this expansion, then you get the non-relativistic expression for the baryon potential in momentum space. And then if you want to go to configuration space, then you do the Fourier transformation. And typically this is the expression you get in the end of the day in momentum in coordinate space. So you have a sum over all possible mesons that you are including in your model. And then you have, okay, everything, okay, this is, but okay, here is a Yukawa factor. But it's the way of the, I will, okay, this is, it's not, I think, okay, so you have your Yukawa factor basically everywhere. And then you have the different contributions depending on the mesons that you have been exchanging. So you have a central piece, you have a spin term, then you have a spin orbit with, okay, some additional dependence on R, not just the Yukawa factor, and then you have the tensor. But this comes directly, so you can do it explicitly. Take a pion, for instance, do everything, and then you will see that the pion is at the end, the guy that is generating the tensor, for instance. And okay, and that's all. This is your potential in coordinate space. It has not much mystery. Okay, the last thing that have to be considered in this kind of models is that, especially because, okay, once you have the potential, what you want to do is to compute things, in particular phase shift, for instance, or properties of the deuteron. And you have to include a form factor. So each vertex have to be multiplied by a form factor. The form factor, in fact, there are in the market two types of form factors. So the typical ones which are used, for instance, in the case of, I think, the Bohm and Jülich models, are either monopole form factors, so basically a form factor of this type, where you have some cutoff associated with each one of the mesons, and then you have this exponent, which is typically the case equal to 1 in the case of a monopole form factor, or 2 in this case you have a dipole form factor. The other standard choice for the form factor is a Gaussian, and this is what the potential models from Nijmegen group use normally, that they use a Gaussian. But it's the same idea. So you introduce something that, in fact, originally was introduced simply because if you don't introduce this and then you try to solve for instance, the thematic equation, the Lyman-Springer equation, it simply explodes. So it does not converge. So you have to kill basically the high momentum. And this was introduced originally for some mathematical reason, but there is a physical reason behind. And the physical reason is that, of course, so we are basically using a model which is an effective model that does not take into account the real structure of the nucleus, so the quark gluon structure. So this basically takes into account all this really short part of the internal structure of the quark gluon structure of the nucleus or of the baryons in general. And then of course this is a kind of something obvious. The model is valid until the real structure of the nucleus starts to be important, because then you have to change model. So that was for the meson exchange. The second type of phenomenological models are the so-called potential models. And in this case, so basically they have, so the standard one or the most known one are the potential from the group of Urbana and the Argon. And typically they have this kind of structure. So these are, in the case of the Argon, these are potential which are local potentials, so they depend only on the relative core distance between the two of the nucleons. And they are basically the sum of some, there is some function on the coordinate multiplying some operator. And these operators basically take into account of the different symmetries. So, translational invariance, Galilean invariance, rotational invariance, and also parity reflection, space reflection, time reversal. Of course, the invariance when you exchange two of the variables, the isospin asymmetry and the neticity. So when you take into account all these things, this one possible set of operators that preserve basically all these symmetries have this type of structure. So in the case of the Argon 18, it's called 18 because there are 18 operators. So the first 14 ones are these ones. So basically you have the identity multiplied the identity. So you have a central term, and then you have again a spin, tensor, spin orbit, and then you have corrections. You have the square of the angular momenta, the square of the angular momenta times the spin, and the square of the spin orbit. And the same but multiplied by the isovector part, so by tau prime. The additional 4 operators are operators that explicitly break the charge symmetry in the case of the Argon potential. And these are these operators. So in this case, proton, neutron, and neutron interaction are not exactly the same. And this is taken into account in this potential by means of this additional 4 pieces. So there are versions of the Argon 14, which basically contains all these 14 operators. And in this case, the interaction, I mean, the model itself is completely symmetric. It preserves charge symmetry. So it's not, does not take into account the fact that in fact neutrons and protons are not exactly the same. And this. So this is a relatively quite old model, but this is still in use. So this is from '95. That is one of the most popular, type of potential models that is used. So let me say before I move to the chiral perturbation, these are 2 nucleon forces, but in fact, 3 nucleon forces are important, and they are important because if you want to reproduce the properties of nuclei, in particular the light nuclei, unless you include 3 body forces, you are not going to do. You're not going to be able to reproduce them. And also, okay, so if you use one of these potentials, the 2 body potentials, in a calculation of the properties of for instance, symmetric matter, unless you include 3 body forces, if you use a many body approach which is non-relativistic, you are not going to reproduce properly. So you are not going to get properly the saturation point. And you only recover the proper saturation point when you include 3 body forces. So I'm mentioning this because historically, together with this Argon potential, this potential model, it was developed a 3 body force, which is this Urbana type model, which is more or less a kind of the same philosophy. So it contains basically 2 pieces, this interaction. This is Urbana type. So you have a 2 pion exchange model, interact force, where essentially you excite the delta isobar, and this gives attraction. And in fact, this piece here is the responsible to get a proper description of the light nuclei when you use this kind of potential. And then there is another piece, which is a completely phenomenological repulsive term. And this is in fact the one that guarantees that high densities, when you go to infinite matter, you increase the energy per particle. But of course, this is again a phenomenological model. There are models which are more or less microscopic ones in which they contain essentially the same attraction coming from the exchange of 2 pions and the filtration of the delta. And then there are contributions, which are these called set diagrams, where basically you excite an antinucleon here. Then these 2 guys are basically giving repulsion. So on this philosophy, essentially this guy is the same. So this is Gitton Yetzava term. And this repulsive phenomenological part in the case of Urbana is basically giving the same effect as these two terms. Now, the problem is that this, you can apply, let's say, add distributive force to any type of phenomenological potential, but all the parameters have to be refitted each time you use. Because so there is no a universal three-body force that you can add to any two-body potential. Meson exchange or phenomenological one. This is not the case when you go to the chiral perturbation. So the chiral perturbation expansion is something that goes back already to the 90s. So the original idea was from Weinberg. And he realized that in principle, it's possible to describe the nucleon interaction in terms of just nucleons and pions, essentially. So this is the original chiral perturbation model. Now there are versions which are a bit more sophisticated that also include, for instance, the excitation of the delta resonance at the relevant degrees of freedom. So in this case, the idea is, and I will show you later. So you start from again from a Lagrangian, which is the most general one that is compatible or respects some symmetries of QCD, in particular the chiral symmetry. And then what you do is you expand, you make a kind of expansion in powers of some quantity, which is a momentum, divided by some scale, scalar scale. And then you get this kind of hierarchy of forces. And normally they are classified as low order or leading order, next to leading order, next to leading order, next to leading order. And then what you see is that at the lowest order, the interaction is very simple. It's simply a pion exchange. So in the same idea, I mean, with the same philosophy of the meson exchange model, and some contact terms. And these contact terms will take into account of everything that basically you have not included here. And it only gives you two-body forces, nothing else. When you go to the next order, you have, in addition to this, of course, new pieces in your interaction, but still, this is still at the order of two-body forces. If you want to the appearance of three-body forces, then you have to go to the next to leading order. And then you have, in addition to these two pieces, some additional terms that contribute to the two-body force, and then you start to see some new contributions that contribute at the level of three-body forces. And these are completely, they appear in a consistent and natural way. So you don't have to build apart the three-body force that have to be added to the two-body force. This simply appear when you go to higher orders in this expansion. They appear in a natural way. And this is, in fact, this is one of the powerful part of this theory, that is, you don't need to worry independent. I mean, you have the high nucleon forces appear in a natural way. And the important thing is that not only appear in a natural way, it basically means that most of the couplings are already defined at the level of two-body forces. Maybe you have new couplings, new constant that you have to fit, but most of them are already there here. So everything is more or less, you don't need to refit everything each time you need to have a new force. And then, of course, if you continue with this expansion to the next order, then you start to have contribution for 4 nucleon forces. Of course, then you can ask, okay, what is the importance if I go to infinite matter for at very high densities, a very relatively high and also high densities, probably 4 body forces are not important, but they will start to be important at some point. And then they have to start to worry. So let me give you some details on the lowest order and the next to leading order. So this is the leading order, and as I say at the beginning, this basically consists on 2 pieces. So you have 1 pion exchange, or in general, okay, pseudoscalar. So originally it was just for pions, but in principle it can be a pseudoscalar. And then you have this 4 body terms, so contact terms. And okay, these are basically constrained by SU3 flavor symmetry. Now, the Lagrangian density that describes this part here, so this 2 pion exchange, is simply this guy here, and I will describe more or less the different pieces. So okay, first you have this bracket here, which is just is a trace. So these are matrices, and this means that you have to take the trace in flavor space of this guy. This B is just the baryon matrix. It's in fact it's a SU3 flavor reducible representation of the baryon object. Okay. And move this slide. Okay. Okay, there are some other matrix elements here, so which contain basically the baryon fields. And this is a SU3 matrix. It's one of the reducible representation of the baryon. Yeah. So this is the, and then of course T bar is gamma daga B whatever. Then you have a covariant derivative. Yeah. Thanks. M0 is just is a baryon mass matrix in the chiral limit, and then in addition you have some couplings. So F and D are just some numerical numbers. So in fact, these two couplings. So the sum of these two is equal to the axial vector coupling, and it is fixed to this value 1.26. And then you have essentially the meson fields, and these are coded by means of this guy here, where you have basically U mu is just this combination of this matrix, which later with the some derivatives. So the meson fields are basically encoded here. So this is this matrix which contains exponential of the, again, very similar to the baryon SU3 irreducible representation. This is the pseudoscalar matrix, and then you have the baryon decay constant. So these are all the ingredients for the contribution of this one pseudoscalar. I say pseudoscalar because in fact when you expand everything, you have contribution from. In fact, this describes all the interaction of all the baryon octet with all the baryon, all the meson octet in principle. Y ahora pues que no.
¿Qué pasa ahora?
Okay, okay. So when you take this Lagrangian and then you do exactly the same as it was done for the meson exchange. So you take your three level diagram, and then you apply corresponding Feynman rules for the diagram with this Lagrangian. In the end of the day, you get this kind of contribution for the baryon potential, for the one pseudoscalar exchange potential, which is very similar to the meson exchange one. So in the end of the day, well, since it's a pseudoscalar, you of all the possible pieces, I mean, if you include all this, I mean, at the beginning when I was showing the meson exchange, you have the tensor bar and everything. Here, since this is a pseudoscalar, this is this contribution, which again is the tensor in the end. So you have this bar, which is going to give you the tensor. There are, okay, these are just couplings. It's a combination of all the different couplings of the vertices. And then you have some isospin factors. So this depends, this contains everything, all these square roots or whatever that you saw on these matrices. So these are basically isospin is a number, which depends on the particular channel that you are going to consider. But this is the form of the potential. It's very similar to what you get for a pion exchange in a meson exchange model, for instance. Formally it's very similar. And it should be because it's exactly the same type of diagram. So then at the leading order, you still have these contact terms. And in fact, the minimal number of Lagrangian densities that describe these terms are there are basically three Lagrangian densities, which that if you impose, that preservation of all the symmetries of QCD and everything, that the most general three Lagrangian densities that are compatible are basically these three guys, where you have some couplings. So these are just constant. Normally are called low energy constants. So they are constants that have to be fixed to fit to reproduce the data, scattering data. And then you have again some traces that involve the matrix of the baryon matrices, so SU3 irreducible representation of the baryon octet, and then these gammas, which are, again, as in the case of the meson exchange potential, are simply this Dirac structure. Sometimes they are called 3-4 algebras. So this is the entity matrix, gamma mu, this tensor, gamma mu, gamma phi, and gamma phi. So it's exactly the same as in the case of the meson exchange. So there are the only possible 5 Dirac structure that can be that you can have in the end of the day. And then, as I said, these are just constant, low energy constant that are fixed or determine. So once you have the potential, then you compute observables, in particular scattering data, for instance, the phase shift, and then you simply fix these couplings by fitting the data in the end of the day. So when you put everything together, the final form, or the more compact form of this contribution to the potential is of this form. So you have a central term, which is just a this is a number, and it's a combination of these low energy constants, and then you have another constant which multiplies this operator structure. So it's just spin term. So in this order, you have this plus the one pseudo-scalar meson exchange, and this is your potential if you want to stop at that order. That is not the end of the day, because okay, this I will mention later. This is still a form factor that has to be considered, which contains a cutoff. And in fact, this introduces a cutoff dependence in these potentials. Then, when you go to the next order, to the next leading order, in this case, the contribution is, well, I show you different. So this is not the complete contribution. There are these pieces, and then, okay, there's contact there which are similar to the other ones, and then there are pieces which have two meson exchanges. Okay, so this is so you have all these contributions. Now, the most simple one is the contact. But in this case, a bit okay. I mean, as I said, I'm not giving you all the details because you have to start from a given Lagrangian and do all the same game, and in the end of the day, you get something like that. This is the contribution from this contact term at the next leading order. It's a bit more complicated than the previous one. So you have, to begin with, you have a momentum dependence. So this is a potential. This depends on the momentum, on the energy. And then you have, okay, spin terms, a total spin, and this is probably going to give you a, spin orbit contribution, and so on and so forth. And then in addition, you have 8 additional constant, low energy constant. Each time you go to the next order, the number of constants, okay, you have some constants or couplings that are already obtained from the previous order, but you have new ones, which means that you have to fit in some way at the end of the day. And then you have the expression for these two pseudo-scalar meson exchange. And in this case, I don't show you the expression because they are really long and cumbersome. But if you're interested, I can provide you some reference where you can find all the corresponding expression for these guys here. Okay. So and then a final comment, which is what I was mentioning. No? So you have to introduce again in each one of the vertices a form factor, as in the case of the meson exchange, because otherwise, when you try to solve the Riemann-Springer equation to obtain the T matrix and to compute the scattering observables, this is simply going to explode. It's not converging unless you regularize the vertices. And this is done in a similar way as in the case of the meson exchange. In that case, was a monopole form factor or dipole, or a Gaussian. In this case, is this kind of exponent. It's not a Gaussian because you got this is exponential with the momenta. Okay, these are quadri-momenta, so you have the momenta to the energy to the 4th power, and then you have this cutoff, and the cutoff basically is typically taken between 400 or 500 and 700. And in fact, this cutoff dependence is what is shown here. So these are phase shift obtained with these forces. The dots are the experimental data, and the different bands correspond to different values of the. Okay, this is a mixture. There is a different orders, and at a given order, the size of the band is related with the dependence of the cutoff. So in principle, if you include more and more orders, the dependence of the cutoff becomes smaller and smaller, but it still is still there. Okay, so you have one question. So now let me move to the this renormalization group method, here the idea is the following. I mean, as you already saw, so typically, when the baryon-baryon or the nuclear-nuclear interaction is has a repulsion at very short distances. And then, okay, how big is this repulsion depends on the model. There are models which are hardcore models where basically this repulsion is extremely high, and there are other models which are not so high and they are so soft core. But in any case, this repulsion is introducing problems when you want to use this kind of interaction in a kind of you want to make some calculation, because this is going to produce, in particular, is going to make any perturbation calculation impossible directly with interaction. So you have to just to regularize in some way the interaction. So one possibility, which is behind this renormalization group method, is that, okay, I know that typically the nuclear interaction or the baryon-baryon interaction has this high momentum, high momentum repulsion or low short range repulsion. So let's try to remove it from the beginning. So let's start from an interaction, and before using it or trying to use it in any type of nuclear structure calculation or whatever, let's try to renormalize the interaction. So let's try to remove this part here, which is the part that is going to produce problems if I want to do some calculation. This happened by itself. I didn't touch anything. Okay. So the idea is the following. The idea is, okay, I start from my original interaction, which can come from whatever model of you want, I mean, one of these measurement chains or I don't know, whatever. And then I'm going to basically integrate all this high momentum part. So in the end of the day, I will end with an interaction which is basically I've integrated all the high momentum components. So if I do this, and of course, I mean, what I want to tell is an interaction that should still be used to in particular to obtain scattering data, for instance. So it means that when I do this, I will obtain, for instance, a Liebman-Springer equation, or the one from which I can obtain, for instance, phase shift, which is modified in the following sense. So typically, when you solve the Liebman-Springer equation, this integral goes up to infinity. And now I'm cutting it. So since I'm cutting it, the modified Liebman-Springer equation will be basically the same, I mean, as the original one, but with an integral here which is cut up to some value lambda, which is a given cutoff. So and it's a cutoff that I choose a priori. So I want to remove all the high momentum that are above this lambda. Now, since you want, in the end of the day, that nothing should depend on this cutoff, because at the end of the day, when I will use this P matrix, I want to obtain, I mean, the scattering data independently of the value of the cutoff that I use to build this interaction. So you impose that, in fact, there should not be dependence on lambda, on the T matrix, and this is what is typically done. So you impose that the variation of the T matrix that you obtain by solving this modified Liebman-Springer equation should not depend on lambda. So when you do this, what you obtain, okay, this is not immediate. I mean, it's not that I come from here and I really do that. There are some steps. You get this, let me call differential equation for the interaction, which is called this renormalization group equation for the interaction. So I get an equation that if I iterate, if I solve, in the end of the day, is going to give me this interaction that is doing this job. It's an interaction where I have cut it all the momentum up to some given value lambda, and then when I integrate it here, I get the proper T matrix. And I can choose a different value of lambda, and in the end of the day, I will get exactly the same T matrix, because this is what I want. So what you see here, this is just an example of what is, okay, that is what you obtain. But the funny thing is that and this is a real calculation. Independently of the interaction where you start, so these are some nucleon-nucleon interactions that have some diagonal matrix elements for this Paris, this potential model that I meson exchange model that I mentioned before, one of the models, the bond A and one of these named again. And these are the matrix elements. So this is these are this is the 1s0 matrix element. And I use them they are different. Of course, all these interactions are phase shift equivalent. So when I use all of them and I compute the phase shift, I obtain the same phase shift because there are parameters that have been fit in order to reproduce that. But the funny thing is that if I use any of these as an input when I solve to obtain this this below K interaction, I get always all of them collapse on the same interaction. So in that sense, this below K interaction is universal. So whatever, doesn't matter from which really very interaction I start, but in the end of the day, once I have integrated all this high momentum dependent, I get an interaction that is universal, is the same for all of them, doesn't matter. And okay, it's of course it's phase shift equivalent because of course if I now compute the matrix with this, I will get by construction the same T matrix and therefore the same phase shift. Does not depend on the energy, it's really energy dependent, and it's softer because I built by it. I mean, with this purpose, I wanted to eliminate all this high momentum repulsion, and it's emission. And now, since this is a soft interaction, in principle, I can use it in any kind of perturbation calculation without problems. So I don't really need to worry about that any perturbation expansion is not going to converge. It's going to converge because I have eliminated this high momentum part. So this kind of interaction is very suitable, in particular to perform nuclear structural calculation in a kind of efficient way, because you have already integrated all these short-range correlations. Now, the point is that this is working very well for the nucleon-nucleon part, and it has been also extended for the Peronic sector. So there are also some work where people have tried to build some kind of universal below K hyperon-nucleon interaction, and in that case, it's not so clear. So there is, I don't have a plot here, but it's not so clear that when you start from different hyperon-nucleon interactions, you converge to the same universal one. There is some kind of tendency, but it's still not the case. So, anything else to finish?
Should we stop here?
Well, I have one more thing to finish. In fact, and I think it's better to finish with this because then I go to the theoretical approach, which is just a few comments on lattice QCD. So I'm not really an expert on lattice, so don't ask me anything. So what I can tell you simply is that, okay, the idea that is behind the lattice QCD calculation is that, okay, it's simply to go from the continuum to replace the continuum form of momentum for four-dimensional space-time into a discrete four-dimensional space. So basically, you represent your space in a kind of lattice where all the quark fields are defined on the nodes of the lattice, and then you have the gluon fields which are living on the links between the different nodes. And then the idea here is that, okay, of course this is that discrete, so you have to define some size for the lattice, and then also some size for the interspace. And then the idea behind everything is, okay, now I can try to treat this as a kind of statistical system. So you apply all the methods that you can for statistical mechanics in order to compute matrix elements and correlation functions between the different others. Here the problem is that to compute these matrix elements in the correlation functions, basically you have to generate many configurations. So most of the problem is numerical. You have to generate an enormous number of configurations when you compute matrix elements or correlation functions, and this requires a lot of time, especially because everything depends a lot on the size of the lattice and also on the distance. So it's really, and this is related also with the fact that, okay, if you want to go to the real physical limit where the masses of the quarks are the physical ones of U1. If you think in terms of pion, to the physical pion mass. Do calculations on the limit of the physical masses is very expensive. Because at the end of the day, this is basically approaching you to the continuum. So there is a connection between the mass, the value of the mass, and the size of these guys. And when you go to the continuum, basically this is equals to 0, and then the size. So in the end, it means that you have to generate an enormous number of configurations. And of course, all the integrals have to be done with a Monte Carlo approach. But anyway, there have been progress from lattice QCD on the derivation of the baryon interaction. And in particular, there are two groups. One is, or two collaborations. Now I don't remember what is the meaning of MPL QCD. I don't know. I don't know if this is non-perturbative lattice QCD. And then HAL QCD, and I think HAL has to do. It's a kind of joke with the computer of 2001. I think they use this kind of joke, but anyway, don't believe me. So these are some calculations from these two collaborations that basically follow two different strategies. In the case of the MPLQCD, they basically use a kind of combination of lattice, really, so calculation of correlation of two baryons in the lattice with effective field theories. And basically they use this kind of a combined strategy in order to deduce some phase shifts. And what you see here, it's not easy because what they have here is not exactly the phase shift, but some combination. So this is some momenta with some the cotangent of the phase shift as a function of the energy. And this is not for nucleon, but for some irreducible representation of the baryons. And then there is a HAL QCD. In this case, what they do is basically they determine in the lattice calculation what is called the Nambu-Bethe-Salpeter wave function, which is this object here. Why? I mean, there is no logic in this script. Okay. So this object here, where basically you start from, so here you have the vacuum, and here you have a two baryons, so 6 quarks with a given energy. And then you compute this matrix element with this operator n, which is basically an antisymmetric combination of 3 quarks. So basically, you are building a quark, 2 quark stacks, or 2 baryons. Then, when you have this wave function, which is built in the lattice, what they do is they employ this in order to extract the potential in some way. So they have a kind of Schrodinger equation here where they plug this wave function here, and then so here is the Schrodinger equation written in a different way. So you have the eigenvalue here, the kinetic energy, and then on the right you have the potential. And the potential is basically obtained here. So you have a kind of non-local potential which is built in this way. So they have some they localize the potential in fact, and then they have this guy here, which is the potential. And typically they assume the usual form. So some central term, some tensor part, spin orbit, and so on and so forth. So they have on one side this wave function which is obtained from the lattice. They use this and then they impose this kind of potential. They solve this and then basically they obtain observables. So when they have this potential, they can compute the different scattering phase shift, and in the same, at the end of the day, you also get a kind of potential. So this is basically assuming this kind of form for the potential and employing this with this wave function in the lattice, they extract the form. I mean, it's a bit tricky, but this is what they do. Okay, and this again, this is a particular result for this particular lattice, and you see for a mass of the pion which is as far from the physical limit. And I think probably this is a good point to stop, because then tomorrow I will move to the approaches to obtain how to solve the many-body problem. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, questions, doubts?
Yeah, question. So, for these different approaches to obtain models, you have commented the chiral perturbation theory, the potential approaches, and then also meson exchange.
Mhm.
So all of these are effective field theories, and so
Okay.
I imagine.
Okay, I mean, what people normally call effective field theory is just for the chiral effective field theory.
Yeah, but you have also a expansion constant in the meson Lagrangian.
In fact, okay, I mean, if you want, everything is effective in the sense that you use hadrons instead of quarks. So in that sense, I mean, you can. I mean, people don't use the word effective to refer for meson exchange. They employ only for chiral effective field or effective field theory in this sense. But it's true that everything is effective in the sense that it's not fundamental.
I mean, my question was, for example, for these potential models, what is the scale of your model? What will be the analogous object to a interacting term in which you expand your model to choose, for example, the number of terms in your potential?
Ah.
I mean, why 18 terms? In that
Yeah, why
potential
18?
or 20, for example?
Well, in fact, there are models. These are Carbon 28.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, okay. I think 14. Okay, for this additional 4 are especially included because these people wanted to take into account that the charge symmetries break. And in fact, there is a previous version which is a 14, which only contains this, and I think 14 is probably the minimum they need in order to impose all these symmetries. So probably is the minimum number. I am not sure, but probably is. I mean, at least in this case, okay, you have to impose or you want to preserve all these symmetries, and I think the minimum number of operators that you need to achieve this is 14. Is, if I don't remember, because I think there is another version previous to the Argon for the Urbana, and I think it's also Urbana 14. I think 14 is the minimum, but and probably the reason is because this is the minimum you really need to preserve this. Then everything else is you go beyond. Because if you already have this preserved, then you can impose other things. For example, this version with 28 is because they also include the delta isobar. So this is a potential only for nucleon the 18. But if you want to describe on the same level, for instance, the delta excitation, one possibility that these people did is to include additional terms that include the interaction of the delta with the delta and the delta with the nucleons. And this, for some reason, implies 10 more operators. But they have this one, so this 18 plus 10 more in order to include the.
So it does not anything to do with the expansion.
No,
in this
this
case,
is not
no.
a Taylor expansion.
No. In this case, no.
No, you just put in the operators which describe symmetries.
Yeah.
And you put them in. How the
Yeah.
more you put, the better you
Yeah.
can describe the symmetries. But it's not a Taylor expansion. There is no coupling constant here.
No, in that sense, the chiral perturbation is more. I mean, it's really an expansion because here it comes directly. You expand in this quantity in the momenta divided by some scale, and the different pieces appear in a natural way. In this case, no, and also in the case of the meson exchange, it's not really an expansion because here you make a choose. So you say, okay, I know that I have all these mesons at my disposal, but then you are completely free. Which ones do you include?
Yeah, in that case, for example, you cannot obtain the potential by making an expansion mass of the values.
Well, in fact, here the potential is obtained because if you take this Lagrange and then you do this, what you get is a complete relativistic full expression. But then what is done is you make a non-relativistic reduction of this, and this is done by making this what I mentioned here. You take the spinor and then you make this expansion in the non-relativistic limit. Because normally, I mean, most of these potentials are non-relativistic. At least these meson exchange ones.
So
Which of course is tricky because and you want to use this, you have always a problem. Okay, it's non-relativistic. Up to which point I can use it or not.
So then the potential approach, how do you know the range of validity of
Well, the range of validity in principle of all these guys is so you use the scattering data So in principle, you can use up to the energy of which you have data. Everything else is an extrapolation. But this is also true for the chiral perturbation theory, because they also, okay, all these couplings or low energy constant that they have here are fitted to scattering data. So in principle, if you go to energies 300 MeV, so if you want them to employ larger energy, it's always extrapolation because you have fitted everything up to here.
Yeah, in this case, this approach by itself tells you this.
In this, yeah.
Making an expansion in this particular. So you have this state.
I mean, the point is that, I mean, if you're aware up to which energy or to you can trust your potential is okay. The point is okay. If you want to use, in fact, I mean, when you, I mean, I will show you tomorrow. When you go when you want to describe the question of state of neutron star matter, you have to go to regions of density, but probably the interaction itself it's questionable for sure.
And then what happens, for example, you want to add another degrees of freedom, for example, you want to add hyperons. No, you mentioned something at some moment, no? That some
in fact,
some forces they include.
It's more, and there is also,
but they are not, I mean, they're only very few data, no?
Yeah.
For
in fact, for instance, I know that these people from Jülich, they have a model, a chiral perturbation theory model for hyperon nuclear interaction. But of course, in that case, they don't go. I don't remember well, but I think I mean, they have the model for sure at lowest order, and they have some couplings that they fit in order to reproduce some hypernuclear data. But then when they go to the next to in order, then the number of these low energy constants increases exponentially, and they don't have data physically to fit them.
They are no data.
No, in fact, here the problem with this approach is that when you move from one order to the next order, the number of new couplings that appear is most of the cases increase very fast. And then, okay, in the case of the nucleons, it's not a big problem because you have quite a lot of data. But if you want to extend this approach to another sector, this is a problem. No, that you cannot do many things. Either you stay at some level of expansion that, okay, at least you know that the couplings you are using are more or less fit, or otherwise you're simply extrapolating, and then you cannot trust too much.
Okay. Some other question? So if not, I think we should stop here and we will continue tomorrow morning. So thank you very much. Ahora ya puedes tocar todo lo que quieras.
Deja de tocar.
Yo quiero uno de estas
Es
cosas.
el viento, es el viento.
Pero a veces yo no lo he tocado, se cantaba solo.
Porque yo creo que la pantalla
Igual tiene un mínimo de.
He ido, está como-
Sí, vamos a dejar de compartir pantalla porque seguramente nos estén oyendo todavía.
Salí por aquí.
Y recording. Espera, voy a parar de. Stop record.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.